a lot of the things that they're protesting against are made in Brussels, are made on an EU level.
In actual fact, the land tax is an incredible burden on, say, retirees.
No political party in the West is yet brave enough to say that we're going to revise that target.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Aussie Wire News. Today, we're speaking with Bill Wirtz, who's going to help us to understand the nuance and detail that's going on with the farmers' protests in Europe, the concessions that they've won, the political success that they've had, and trying to understand what all of that means. Then we're going to speak with Ross Clark about the retreat from net zero. It's amazing the difference between what countries are doing and what they're saying. And if we track what they're saying, there's some very good signs that some sanity is creeping into this particular debate. And then we'll finish with an interview with Professor Sinclair Davidson, an Australian economist. We're going to talk about the Victorian COVID-19 debt levy and the impact that that's likely to have on the people who can afford it least. All of that is coming up right now on the Aussie Wire News. Well, I know many of you have been following the various farmer protests in Europe very, very closely. We heard some great news last week that it seems like there was some progress, some breakthrough, perhaps some concessions. However, I wanted to get someone on who's really been following this very, very closely. He can help us to unpack the different groups of farmers, the different demands, the different countries, because it's not just a single movement. There is quite a lot of detail and nuance to what's going on. So I brought on none other than Bill Wirtz. Bill, thank you so much for joining us here on the Aussie Wire.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you've been following this very, very closely. You've been actually doing a little bit of media and talking about this and helping, for example, people like myself over here in Australia to try and wrap my head around what is going on. There is a bit of a perception in Australia that all the farmers are rising up for the same reasons and what they want is their freedom. I wish it was that easy, but it's not though, is it?
It's a lot more complicated, and it varies quite significantly between which country you're talking about. In the Netherlands, it's environmental regulation. In Germany, it's tax reasons for taxes on diesel. In France, it's everything almost, so everything from trade to negotiations with retailers. In Central and Eastern Europe, it's about trade with Ukraine and the price of wheat coming out of Ukraine. There's a lot of different reasons. I think the uniting factor is the fact that farmers feel disenfranchised and not listened to by a lot of the policymakers that make those environmental policies, essentially blaming the reason, putting the reason for why we have problems in terms of why we need climate change action, putting all of that responsibility on the farmer. And I think that is really fueling the protests.
To what degree are these protests focused at the European Union as a sort of a federated body? And to what degree is their ire being directed towards their own national governments?
So it's a mix. It's interesting because in some countries, farmers are simultaneously protesting in their capital cities and then also moving to Brussels, which is where the European Union's institutions are located, to protest bureaucracy at that level as well. Because farmers do understand that even though there is some leeway for member states of the European Union to change policies, a lot of the things that they're protesting against are made in Brussels, are made on an EU level. And the member states can't actually really influence that policy unless there's policy changes on an EU level. So they often do both. It depends on how close you are to that border and how easy it is to get to Belgium with your tractor. But ultimately, they do protest on both levels. And interestingly, they're also having impacts locally on some of the environmental regulations that countries try to implement, and the Netherlands was a good example.
Well, these protests have often been quite deliberately disruptive, quite deliberately provocative. What's the level of public support? I mean, we're seeing scenes here. There's been extraordinary things, obviously, the dumping of produce onto highways to block them. We saw a blockade around Paris. We've seen manure being spilled onto the streets. We've seen fires being lit in some places. Obviously, again, this is all disparate activity happening in different parts of Europe. What's the public mood like? Are they enjoying a lot of popular support, or is the disruption perhaps eroding that?
They are enjoying a lot of support. And what was so interesting in Germany is that even though they were blocking the roads in and out of major cities and making a lot of people late for work, 80% of people in Germany, even those that are not associated with the agricultural sector whatsoever, were supportive of the protest. The same was true in the Netherlands. The same is true in France. So this is really having political repercussions. And I think one of the reasons for that is because what people see in terms of their energy bills, energy prices going up because of environmental policies, they say, okay, well, the farmers must be mad for the same reason. So we are supporting them. So there's really been a shift over the last few years in Europe on environmental policy. In 2019, if you took a selfie with Greta Thunberg as a politician, election, it was a boost for your campaign. Now nobody would touch that issue.
No, it is interesting, and certainly getting the common man, the city dweller, to identify themselves with farming issues is something that I've been trying to do here in Australia around irrigation water restrictions that have happened, that have very much harmed our irrigation sector in my region of Australia. It's a very, very difficult thing to do, and if you're right that that's actually what's driving the sympathies here, then that could become quite a powerful political voting bloc. Now, speaking of politics, I want to talk about what's been happening with the Dutch farmers recently. They actually organised and formed a political party, and they've had some considerable success. Do you put that down to the success of the protests feeding politics, or is that a separate issue?
So the provincial election in the Netherlands was in early 2023 and really followed the protests, and overwhelmingly people voted for a farmers' party. I mean, a party that actually did exist previously, but was a very, very small party, and suddenly had the success where the only way the government could actually approve policy and get it through the Dutch Senate, so the provincial elections essentially get people elect members for the Senate, was if they had the approval of the Farmers' Party, and then the government fell for different reasons, and there were new elections, and now the Farmers' Party is in coalition talks to be even part of the national government, which means that a Farmers' Party is now on the level of, maybe having the agricultural minister as one of their portfolios. So what we see is that as politics has made farming more political, farmers have politicized as well. And so this is really has led farmers to say, okay, there's only so much we can do in terms of protest. We might have to become active politically as well, which comes with its own challenges. I mean, there's been a lot of debate over what are the policies of those farmer parties on other issues, and sometimes they don't really know because they're not political animals. They're not made for this world, and so they run into difficulties on that front as well. We've seen that in the Netherlands, but ultimately what we see now is that Dutch farmers have organized politically and have been successful.
Well, an agricultural minister who actually comes from agriculture, what will they think of next? That would be quite an extraordinary thing to see. Now, we have seen recently some celebrations, claims that these protests are working, that concessions have been made. What can you tell us about that? Are these EU-level concessions? Are they substantial? Does this really represent a win, or are they just clutching at straws here?
They're on both ends. So in Germany, for instance, the government made concessions on the taxes on diesel, has said that it's going to phase out the exemption over time. The farmers are still protesting to get a complete repeal of that rule, but there have already been concessions. And one of the biggest concessions right now from the European Union has been that the pesticide reduction law, which was one of the cornerstones of the European Green Deal, which was cutting pesticide use by 50% by 2030, that has been scrapped completely.
Wow.
And that was one of the big policies that they wanted to pass. And they said, okay, in the current climate, we can't do it. So what in the upcoming European election in June, environmental policies are going to be one of the driving factors. They were one of the driving factors in 2019, but for very different reasons. Now there's opposition to it. So it's going to be on one of the top line issues on top of energy security and security altogether in Europe, environmental policies being on the chopping block. Yeah.
Well, essentially a referendum on these environmental policies. It's going to be very, very interesting to see whether more countries in Europe head in the same direction as what the Netherlands did at their last general election. Well, Bill Wirtz, thank you so much for helping us to wrap our heads around this relatively detailed and complex issue. I'm certainly backing the farmers. I want to see them win enormous concessions, and hopefully they will stick to their guns and do exactly that. Bill Wirtz, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, if you believe the media, then climate change is the great doom of our time, and policymakers are all rushing to do something about it, especially and specifically to get to net zero as quickly as possible. In fact, the future of human civilization depends on it. And if you just consumed mainstream media, then you'd think that that was the state of play. But thankfully, there are people who are actually looking behind the headlines at what's really going on. And one such person is Ross Clark. He joins me now. Ross, thank you so much for joining us here on the Aussie Wire.
Pleasure.
Now, you've actually published a paper at Net Zero Watch titled The Retreat from Net Zero. You're observing something very different to what the media are telling us about. What have you observed?
Well, I mean, if you go back to COP28, I mean, all these sort of countries were signing communiques saying we're going to phase out fossil fuels, phase down fossil fuels, and so on. But, you look at actually what these countries are doing. Qatar, UAE, who hosted the conference, they're investing £20 billion to increase by 50% their oil output. Brazil, which is now seen as a sort of a climate hero by sort of environmentalists because President Lula is not Bolsonaro, and he's sort of, trying to retreat on trying to stop the sort of deforestation. But he wants to increase fossil fuel oil and gas production, become the world's fourth largest producer. Canada, which was spoiling for the communique to be tougher, they're increasing their oil and gas output. American gas output never been higher. I mean that's the sort of reality behind it. All these countries who will go to COP28 and nod along with the environmentalists and so on. I mean, they accept that fossil fuels are going to be around for quite a while yet. Maybe we offset their emissions. We use carbon capture and storage and so on, which US are very keen on doing. But you cannot just take fossil fuels away from the global economy and expect the economy to thrive. I mean, it would be sort of mass poverty, back to the caves, as the chairman of COP28, president of COP28 said. There's a sort of reality to it that's sort of creeping back into the debate after years, I think, of people say, setting these targets and just hoping for the best, that sort of technology will sort of magically appear in order to fulfill this target. It's very, very severe targets that we've set ourselves to decarbonize the economies by 2050, and the technology is just not there at the moment, and I don't think that any country ultimately is going to impoverish itself to achieve that target. I think we're going to beginning to see more of a reality as these targets sort of collide head on with the reality of what it's going to cost us, and
well, reality has
the pain it's going to inflict on people.
Well, reality has a way of winning in the end. We saw, of course, a reality check with the outbreak of war in Ukraine, and that, of course, had a very significant impact on Europe's energy supplies, particularly heading into that winter that immediately followed that. But your report is available from netzerowatch.com. I have read the entire thing. Your opening chapter, really after the introduction, is actually about the fact that fossil fuel demand has never been higher. So you mentioned there are a bunch of countries that were increasing production. But from your research, it's not just that they're saying, hey, we're going to produce more, but actually we as consumers are using more despite the amount of money that is being spent on things like industrial grid scale solar and wind.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there are, I mean, if you look at Britain, you look at America, European countries, so they're actually reducing their overall carbon emissions. But globally, use of fossil fuels, the carbon emissions are still creeping upwards. And the reason for that is what we're doing in Europe, and to a lesser extent in America, is we're offshoring our emissions. I mean, the UK government, for example, claims that we've claims to have halved carbon emissions since 1990. But, that's on a territorial basis. That just counts the emissions which are physically spewed out within Britain. It excludes the emissions that are emitted elsewhere in the world in the course of creating food and other products for UK consumers. And if you look at it on a consumption basis, it's the reduction in UK carbon emissions is very, very much lower than it is on the territorial basis. And the reason for that is a lot of our production's been offshored to China, and Chinese emissions, of course, are surging.
Well, they are single-handedly replacing the entire Australian economy from a CO2 emissions point of view multiple times over every single year. Now, you mentioned in your report, or you go through in your report, a lot of these other technologies that have been the things that people have pinned their hopes on. They've said hydrogen is going to be the thing that allows us to get to net zero, or it's going to be industrial scale wind and solar, or the development of better batteries, grid scale batteries, heat pumps, these sorts of things. You go through these, each of them in turn, including, and I was very saddened to see actually one of my great hopes, which is small modular reactors. You're not particularly bullish on those either. Could you talk us through a few of these technologies and why it is that they're not driving the kind of change that has been promised?
Yeah, well, I mean, take small nuclear reactors. I mean, I think they could still be part of the energy mix. But even in the best case scenario, I was speaking to Rolls-Royce the other day about this. They are planning, hopefully, to have a small nuclear reactor producing electricity by 2035.
Right.
And they say, we'll scale them up. We'll have about 20 of them, but they're not really expecting the market to go very much further than that. And you think that the amount of electricity that's likely to be generated by small modular reactors will not even replace the electricity that's sort of currently being generated by our aging nuclear power stations, which are all due to close by 2035, bar one in Sizewell B in Suffolk, will be the only one going by 2035, and Hinkley C in Somerset, if we ever get there, if that ever gets completed. So, I mean, nuclear power is actually going backwards in Britain and across the world as well. Germany's closed all its nuclear plants. France has, invested in them more than any other advanced country, but they're not building any more really. They're not expanding nuclear as a proportion of the electricity. US hasn't really sort of gone into nuclear power in a big way since 3 Mile Island in 1979.
Sure.
So, the UK government, for example, has a plan to decarbonize the electricity system entirely by 2035. Well, there's no way that there is going to be nuclear capacity in 2035 to do the job. So, it's being, wind and solar are being talked up, but then you've got the problem of storage and backup for when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining.
So given this disconnect, this growing disconnect between what they're actually doing, the deadlines are looming, the realities are coming home to roost, the costs are becoming increasingly obvious, and yet the rhetoric doesn't seem to be changing. They came out of COP28, yes, with a relatively mealy-mouthed, watered-down statement, but honestly, I would characterise most of the outcomes of the COP type conferences and climate conferences as pretty mealy-mouthed and pretty equivocal in their nature. So I don't see that as a big departure. Where to from here? At what point do the politicians have to start acknowledging these realities in their rhetoric, or are they just going to keep on writing checks with their mouths that the technologies just simply cannot cash?
Well, I mean, what's going on at the moment is that the long-term target, net zero by 2050, that remains in place. And, I think that no political party in the West is yet brave enough to say that we're going to revise that target. But it's the sort of interim targets which are falling by the wayside, the sort of banning electric cars, forcing people to fit heat pumps and the houses rather than banning gas boilers and so on. It's all those targets. As soon as they collide with reality, is they get put back, they get delayed. But of course, it's going to get to a point where you keep delaying those targets, and well, of course, the people say, well, the 2050 target, there's no way you can hit that 2050 target. Well, there's no way, they could ever hit that 2050 target. But at some point, it's going to become glaringly obvious that, that 2050 business net zero is not going to happen. And but I don't think any political party in the West in the next 5-10 years is going to be brave enough to say that. But sort of beyond that, I think the net zero target itself will be watered down.
Well, I think you're probably spot on, and of course the silver lining for our current crop of politicians is that they'll be long gone from politics by the time the reality of the 2050 deadline becomes clear to everybody. They will have already retired and pensioned themselves off. Well, Ross, thank you so much for writing this report. We will put the link into the description of this video so that people can find it and read it for themselves. I've read it from cover to cover. I highly recommend it. Very, very interesting and certainly grim reading. If you're one of those people that believes that we have to decarbonise the economy, then this is certainly a bit of a reality check. Ross, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, they say the two things in life are inevitable, that's death and taxes. But if you're a Victorian right now, it seems that tax increases are pretty inevitable. Whilst the rest of the country is, to one degree or another, celebrating a tax reduction in the form of the much modified and reduced Stage 3 tax reductions, Victorians, well, they're having a slightly different experience. And if there was one thing that Victoria needed, it was, of course, more taxes. Here to talk to me about the impact of this COVID-19 debt repayment tax is Professor Sinclair Davidson. Professor, thank you so much for joining us here on the Aussie Wire.
Thank you for having me again.
Now, people could be forgiven for not jumping for joy in the streets of Melbourne right now, but for those who perhaps aren't landowners, they're not landlords, they don't have investment properties that might be affected by these changes, what are the changes that we've seen introduced by the Victorian government?
Well, I just want to start off by saying around death and taxes, at least death doesn't get worse every year, unlike taxation. So what is happening is that the Victorian government have overspent. They've overspent on infrastructure. They've overspent on shutting down the economy. They basically have been in spend mode to the extent that, the lollipop people who sort of stop the traffic coming and going are on at least $120,000 a year, which is an astonishing amount of money.
Yeah.
And of course, this all has to be paid for. And how do we pay for this? Well, we tax people. Now, one of the terrible things about the Australian Federation is that since the Second World War, we have got taxes horribly wrong. The way our system should work is that the states should levy an income tax and the Commonwealth government should levy all those other nuisance taxes that we currently have.
Right.
And what I say to people, and it sometimes causes a bit of controversy, what I say to people is the Australian taxpayer lost the Second World War.
Oh, right.
Because we end up in a situation whereby the Commonwealth raises more money than it needs to spend, and the states, on the other hand, can't and don't. So we end up with all these very highly inefficient nuisance taxes, which of course stifle economic activity at the state level.
Look,
that's what we're seeing here.
I'm going to have to cut you off because I fundamentally disagree with what you said. You said that what we should see is income taxes being levied at a state level. What we should see is flat taxes in the form of completely squashed flat down at zero. However, in the real world, excuse me, I've not yet made a full recovery. Here in the real world, where taxes are unfortunately inevitable, people are saying, they're defending this particular levy and saying that given the situation, given that the debt is there, that it does need to be repaid, and I mean, there's an argument to be made that at least they're trying to address the problem. Maybe we shouldn't have got into the problem in the first place, but there's an argument to be made that says, well, they're trying to do something about it. There are many people defending this as a really good option, hitting property owners, especially property investors. They're one of the media's favourite whipping boy groups to be able to lay hate onto. They're those evil landlords that are undoubtedly responsible for the housing shortage and for rental properties being so completely unaffordable. Isn't this, of all of the available options, one of the good ones?
Yes and no. Yes, it is, because Adam Smith 250 years ago said that a land tax is a great idea. Now, just to backtrack a bit, how do we get to this conclusion is that there's a thing in economic theory called tax incidence. And this is a story around who bears the burden of the tax. So we have legal incidence, the person who writes the check to the government, and then we have economic incidence, the person who bears the burden of the tax. Now, the economic incidence of the tax depends upon the supply and demand for the good and service being taxed. And this is quite a complicated thing, so I want to keep it very simple. Adam Smith made the argument that the supply of land is fixed. So we have what economists would call an inelastic supply curve. And as a result of the supply curve of land being fixed, you could tax land and it would have no adverse economic consequence. The landlord would be poorer because they would be paying the tax, but there would be no other economic consequence of a land tax. So if you believe that story to be true, then yes, a land tax is a great idea.
Well, I can already poke some holes in it, and I'm sure you weren't finished. I'm sure you had some holes to poke, but I'll name one objection immediately. Excuse me, I'm still recovering from that chest infection I got while I was in the US. The issue there is we don't live on land, we live in houses, in dwellings of some sort, and they have to be constructed. And the construction of a lot of the new ones is funded by investors and speculators who are anticipating making money over the long term, whether by capital growth or through rental. So surely we're going to see a downturn in the availability of new housing supply as we punish investors.
If Adam Smith is right, then your argument is wrong.
Well, Adam Smith is wrong then.
Luckily, Adam Smith made one mistake in his Great Wealth of Nations book where he discussed this, and this was the mistake that he made. He made the mistake of arguing that land is fixed in supply. Now, many of the viewers of this show are going to agree with Adam Smith. They're going to say straight away, of course land is fixed in supply. I mean, you're probably a bit young to remember the original Superman movies, where in the original Superman movies, Lex Luthor, the villain, was trying to create more land. And in the first movie, he was trying to destroy California by blowing up the San Andreas Fault, and he was buying up land in Nevada.
I'm starting to like this guy already, blowing up California.
You are. And in one of the later movies, he was trying to lift the Atlantic Ocean, but he was trying to manipulate land prices because they weren't making more land. Right. But as you said quite correctly, land is not something that we should think about in a geographic sense, where more or less they aren't making anymore. Land is something we should think about in an economic sense. Now, what happens is everybody's got a house, everybody's got a spare room, and if the value of land suddenly becomes a lot more valuable, goes up in price dramatically, all of a sudden the price of the housing stock goes up, and what do? We rent out our spare room. This is the Airbnb model. So in actual fact, the supply of land in terms of housing space and economic space is not fixed. It is variable. And the supply goes up and down as prices go up and down, which more or less means the whole argument that you can tax land with impunity is wrong. Wrong for the very same reasons that you just mentioned. But if I am a policymaker and I have the full weight of economics over the last 250 years, including Adam Smith, and I have on the other side Topher, sorry, Topher, I'm not believing you, because quite honestly, we live in a world where policymakers can't deviate too far from mainstream opinion. And this mainstream opinion has got an incredible, valuable pedigree all the way back to Adam Smith, where he made that one mistake. And unfortunately, it's an important mistake because a lot of people believe you can simply tax land with impunity with no economic cost. There's an entire school of economic thought built around this, based upon the 19th century journalist and economist Henry George. His argument is that you could fund all of society by having a modest land tax as opposed to an income tax, which is just simply wrong.
Well, that's actually amazing you bring that up, because I can recall, it would have to be 10 years ago now, having quite a vigorous debate with someone who was trying to make exactly that argument, saying we could abolish all the other taxes, just have a land tax. And if I recall correctly, he was saying it would be something in the order of 0.25%, about a quarter of a percentage point of the capital improved value of the land. And the arguments he was making, he was simply overplaying his hand. I wasn't opposed, and I'm not opposed to the idea that it might be better than what we've got. I'm open to that argument. But he was making the argument, one, you could abolish every other tax. Number two, that it would magically cause all land to be used in a more efficient manner for a better purpose. And that was so easily debunked. I turned around to him and I said, well, we were on a tram. It was a mate of mine, and this is an ongoing conversation over a long period of time. We were on a tram. I remember where we were. We were on Spencer Street, and there was behind some construction hoarding a block of land that had not had anything done with it for at least 10 years by that point in time. And I pointed to that and I said, if that person owes money on that land and they're paying at least 5% per annum interest already, what's another 0.25% going to do to change their behaviour and to make them finally put that land to use? So it seems that some of the fundamentals, some of the basics of economics are missing in this pro-land tax debate.
Unfortunately, the example of land tax being a tax with a perfect inelastic supply curve is used as an example in almost every single first-year textbook.
Right.
And every first-year economics student learns this and believes it to be true and simply goes through life simply parroting what they've learned at university. Now, one of the biggest problems is that you really struggle to get students to remember the things that are true that you tell them, but they never have any problem remembering the things that are not true. And the idea that a land tax is an efficient tax is one of them. Ironically, a land tax is an astonishingly inefficient tax because one of the principles of taxation is that it should be easy to pay the tax.
Right.
So if you are paying tax on income, you've received money and then you give money back to the government. That is easy way to pay tax. Whereas when you have a land tax, what's happened is very often you don't receive an income from the house or the property that you own already. You've got to sell that property. So in actual fact, the land tax is an incredible burden on, say, retirees, and also on young people who are renting, because what is happening is in the case of Victoria, is that people who are renting, their landlord is being hit by this levy, and they are simply passing on, if not all of it, a fair chunk of it onto their tenants who are renting. And so younger people who haven't got a foot into the household market yet are bearing the burden of this particular tax. So retirees and young people are probably being hit quite hard, people who are less able to pay this tax compared to other forms of taxation that we have available to us. So it's particularly dangerous. The other problem there that we have very often when people say we're going to have a more efficient usage of land, these people are social engineers.
Right.
Now, very often, a lot of social engineers claim to be well-meaning, and indeed some of them even are well-meaning. But we always know that when you get things wrong, you end up making huge mistakes. So we should try to avoid social engineering as much as we possibly can, which means coming back to taxation, your idea of a flat tax is a great idea. In practice, flat at zero, I would love it myself, but let's be practical here.
Hey, a man can dream. Don't
get
crush
away
my
with
dreams.
10%.
Don't crush my dreams.
No, but you could get away with, say, 10 or 15%. And then, of course, the biggest problem in Australia isn't that we tax too little, is that our governments spend too much.
Sure.
And we've actually got to start thinking about mechanisms of constraining that spending. And certainly in the case of the state governments of Australia, where there's like total fiscal irresponsibility as far as the eye can see, where Victoria is simply the worst example of this. Nonetheless, we need to start coming up with mechanisms to constrain spending and live within the already exorbitant taxes that we currently have before governments then start borrowing.
Well, Javier Milei, I think, is giving us a masterclass in what we should at least be trying to do. And it starts with a chainsaw, for those that haven't been following his progress over there. Now, before we finish up, I do want to put some numbers onto this. This has been doing the rounds on X. I don't know the original source of it. I apologize. But someone has stitched together their 2022 and 2024 land tax assessment. So this is someone who presumably owns a rental property. And it has gone up by 2.5 times. This is in Victoria. It has gone up by a factor of approximately 2.5 in 2 years. What happened to the 2023 one, I don't know, but this is comparing 22 with 24. Now, you've already made the point that a lot of this is going to get passed on directly to renters. This strikes me as an incredibly regressive tax. Could you let people in? What's a progressive tax versus a regressive tax, and why is something like this particularly dangerous for low-income people?
So the idea of a progressive tax is that the tax burden increases as your income increases. So the amount that you pay. The idea of a regressive tax is the percentage of your income that you pay as tax increases as your income decreases. So, for example, most taxes in Australia are regressive. So, for example, if you have a flat 10% tax rate and you're earning $100, you are paying $10. If you're earning $200, you're paying $20. And the ratio has remained constant. If the ratio changes as your income increases, so progressive income tax, it goes from, I think it's 19% of the lowest rate to 30 to 37 to 45. As your income rises, that's a progressive tax. Most taxes are regressive, which means that they have a bigger burden on lower income earners than they do on higher income earners. And a land tax in this particular sense would certainly be impacting people who are renting, because after all, that's what the land tax is actually on rental properties, and then also on shops and stores in the CBD and what have you. It's a very narrow tax, the land tax, in any event. But that will be falling on people who have got lower incomes who are renting as opposed to people who are buying. And I think we can safely assume that renters are going to be on lower incomes than people who are buying. There are some exceptions to that particular rule, but certainly younger people renting, lower income people renting, retirees renting, they are the people bearing the burden of this particular tax, the more vulnerable people in society. And we have a left-wing government that be saying, we're slugging the rich. But in actual fact, if you think of many landlords themselves, people who negatively gear, they are sort of middle income earners trying to get ahead, trying to put a little bit of more away for their retirement than super allows. So think of school principals, some teachers, nurses, policemen, these sorts of people who are not on great incomes, but nonetheless can become a landlord because that's a business for them on the side. So these middle income earners and low income earners are actually getting slugged here by a greedy government, basically, who's telling some propaganda story, lying to our faces, in actual fact, lying to our faces about who is actually bearing the burden of this tax. And they should be ashamed of themselves. And good on you, Topher, for calling him out.
Well, if there's one thing that this says to me, it's that the COVID spending party is over. And the time of the hangover is well and truly here. I can't help but think that the pain is only going to get worse for at least a few years for those who are still in Victoria. Professor Sinclair Davidson, thank you as always for coming on the Aussie Wire.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching the Aussie Wire News. We release new episodes of the news every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. You can catch up on past episodes by going to our website, theaussiewire.com. There's also a full range, a smorgasbord of blog posts for you to read there as well. And while you're there, make sure you sign up for the email list so that you don't miss a thing. You can follow all of our socials at The Aussie Wire on pretty much every single social media platform out there. And of course, we'd love for you to become an insider. That's a financial supporter of The Aussie Wire by going to the link in the description and helping to make it financially possible for us to keep doing what we do. This is The Aussie Wire News. I'm Topher Field. Thank you so much for watching.